There was a long period in human history when the human body existed without a layer between itself and the world, not because people chose to be without clothing, but because clothing did not yet exist as a stable solution. The human body was not originally separated from wind, from cold air, from heat, or from the surface it rested on. And yet, over time, the body changed, slowly losing the thick protection that other mammals kept, while not yet gaining anything to replace it. This creates a quiet paradox. Humans became more exposed before they became protected. So what did it actually feel like to live in a body that had already changed but still had no clothing? The human body did not begin as something designed to be exposed, and yet over a long span of time, it gradually became exactly that. Compared to most mammals, the human body carries far less hair, and this absence is not random but part of a slow evolutionary shift that likely favored endurance movement and heat regulation over insulation. As early humans moved across open landscapes under the sun, the ability to release heat efficiently became more important than retaining it, especially during long periods of walking or persistence hunting. In that context, a body with less dense hair and more exposed skin allowed heat to escape through sweating, creating a cooling system that worked across large areas of the body. But this shift came with a quiet cost. The same surface that allowed heat to leave more easily also allowed cold to enter more quickly, and without a layer of fur, the body no longer had a natural barrier against wind, moisture, or sudden changes in temperature. This created a condition where the body became more dependent on behavior and environment to maintain balance. In warmer climates, this exposure could be manageable, but as humans moved into regions where temperatures fluctuated more dramatically, the absence of a protective layer became more noticeable. The body was not failing, but it was operating closer to its limits, adjusting constantly rather than remaining stable. From an evolutionary perspective, this does not suggest that early humans were simply vulnerable, but that they were adapting to a specific set of conditions where heat dissipation was more critical than insulation. However, this adaptation did not come with an immediate replacement for what was lost. There was no clothing yet, no consistent external layer to take over the role of protection. This means that for a significant period, the human body existed in a transitional state, already changed, but not yet supported by new solutions. Archaeological evidence does not preserve skin or hair directly, but comparative biology and fossil records suggest that this reduction in body hair occurred well before the widespread use of clothing, indicating a gap between biological change and cultural adaptation. Within that gap, the human body had to function as both the interface and the limit between itself and the environment. Every movement of air, every shift in temperature, and every contact with the ground was felt more directly, not because the body was weaker, but because it had become more open, and in that openness, a new kind of relationship with the environment was formed, one where exposure was not occasional, but constant, shaping how early humans moved, rested, and responded to the world around them. Once the dense covering of hair was reduced, the human body did not simply become neutral to the environment. It became more responsive to it, because the skin itself took on a larger role in regulating how the body interacts with heat, air, and moisture. Human skin is active rather than passive, with blood flow near the surface changing in response to temperature, and with sweat glands allowing heat to be released through evaporation, especially during movement in warm conditions. This system works efficiently when the surrounding air allows heat to dissipate, but it also means that the body depends on external conditions to maintain balance. Without a layer of fur to trap air close to the body, heat is not held in place, and even small changes in wind or moisture can alter how warmth is retained or lost. When air moves across exposed skin, it can carry heat away more quickly, and when the ground is cooler than the body, heat is drawn downward through contact, gradually lowering body temperature during periods of rest. In contrast, many mammals rely on fur not only for insulation, but for maintaining a more stable microenvironment close to the skin, where air is trapped and temperature changes are slowed. Humans, lacking this layer, experience the environment more directly, not only sensing it but participating in it. This does not mean that early humans were constantly cold or unable to function, but that their bodies had to remain in a state of continuous adjustment, responding to changes that other animals might buffer more effectively. Archaeological and comparative evidence suggests that this exposure became more significant as humans expanded into varied climates, where temperature differences between day and night, or between seasons, were more pronounced. In such conditions, the body's regulatory systems could manage variation within limits, but not indefinitely without behavioral responses, such as movement, posture change, or seeking more favorable locations. This creates a situation where stability is not maintained internally alone, but through an ongoing interaction between body and environment. Over time, this interaction would shape how early humans experienced space, favoring areas where wind was reduced, ground was less conductive, or temperature remained more consistent. The absence of clothing did not prevent adaptation, but it required that adaptation to remain closely tied to immediate conditions, with the skin acting as the surface where all these changes were registered and managed. And within this constant exchange, the limits of biological regulation become clearer, not as a sudden failure, but as a gradual boundary that the body approaches whenever external conditions move beyond what it can adjust to on its own. With less hair covering the body, the surface of the skin became not only a place of regulation, but a continuous point of contact with the surrounding world, where changes in air, temperature, and texture were not filtered but experienced directly. The skin does not simply detect these changes in a passive way, it responds to them through a network of receptors and adjustments that operate without pause. When the air cools, the sensation is immediate, not delayed by any insulating layer, and when the wind shifts, the body registers it across wide areas at once. This creates a form of awareness that is spread across the entire surface of the body, rather than concentrated in a few points. In the absence of clothing, this awareness becomes more constant because there is no stable barrier to reduce the flow of information from the environment. Contact with the ground becomes equally significant. The surface beneath the body, whether it is soil, stone, or vegetation, transfers temperature, pressure, and moisture directly into the skin, shaping how the body settles and how long it can remain still. A surface that draws heat away slowly may be tolerable for a time, but over longer periods, the accumulation of that heat loss begins to affect the body's overall state. Moisture adds another layer to this interaction, as damp ground or humid air can change how temperature is perceived, often making conditions feel more intense without a clear shift in the surrounding environment. From an evolutionary perspective, this constant exposure does not imply that early humans were overwhelmed by their surroundings, but that their experience of the environment was more continuous and less separated. Archaeological evidence cannot capture sensation directly, but it shows patterns of movement and site selection that suggest sensitivity to these conditions, with repeated use of locations that offer even slight moderation of wind, temperature, or surface contact. This indicates that while the body could function without a protective layer, it did not do so without consequence. The need to respond to constant sensory input shaped how space was used, where rest occurred, and how long it could be maintained. Over time, this would contribute to a growing awareness of the limits of exposure, not as a single threshold, but as a gradual accumulation of small effects that the body had to manage continuously. And within that ongoing experience, the absence of clothing is not only a physical condition, but a way of being in the world where the boundary between body and environment remains open, and where every moment of contact contributes to how the body understands and adapts to its surroundings. When the body no longer carries a natural insulating layer, it does not simply exist in the environment, it becomes part of it in a more direct and continuous way, because there is no longer a buffer that slows the exchange between internal and external conditions, and this changes how temperature, airflow, and moisture are experienced across the entire surface of the skin, not as distant signals but as immediate physical realities that shape how long the body can remain stable without adjustment. And in this state, the human body depends on a narrow range of conditions where its internal systems can still maintain balance, but outside that range, the body must constantly respond, shifting posture, moving location, or altering behavior in order to prevent gradual loss of heat or excessive gain of it. And unlike animals with dense fur that can maintain a layer of still air close to the skin, reducing the rate of change, the human body allows air to move freely across its surface, which increases the speed at which heat can be lost, especially when the body is at rest. And this makes stillness itself more difficult to sustain, not because the body is weak, but because it is more exposed to variation, and this exposure is not only about temperature, but about how the body perceives space. Since every surface, every movement of air, and every shift in humidity becomes part of the body's ongoing experience, creating a condition where the environment is not something observed from a distance, but something that is continuously felt and managed. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans responded to this condition not by eliminating exposure, but by selecting spaces where its effects were reduced, such as areas with less wind, more stable ground, or natural features that slowed environmental change. And this indicates that while the body could function without a protective layer, it required careful interaction with its surroundings to remain within its limits. And over time, this relationship between body and environment would shape patterns of movement, rest, and site selection, not as conscious strategies in the modern sense, but as repeated responses to the simple fact that without a natural barrier, the body remains open, and that openness defines how it must live within the world. Compared with mammals that retain dense fur, the human body operates with a different kind of boundary, one that does not trap a stable layer of air close to the skin. And this difference changes not only how heat is retained, but how quickly conditions outside the body are translated into conditions within it, because fur creates a microenvironment where air is held in place and temperature shifts are slowed, while exposed skin allows air to move freely, carrying heat away when the body is warmer than its surroundings, and reducing heat gain when it is cooler. And this exchange can be advantageous during sustained movement in warm environments, where the ability to dissipate heat helps maintain endurance. But it also means that when movement slows or stops, the body loses that advantage and becomes more sensitive to the same processes that previously helped it, especially when wind increases or the ground draws heat through contact. And in animals with fur, this transition from movement to rest does not produce the same degree of change, because the insulating layer continues to buffer the body, allowing a more gradual shift. But in humans without such a layer, the shift can be more immediate, requiring adjustment through posture, location, or timing of activity. And this contrast suggests that early humans were not simply less protected, but differently adapted, relying on behavioral flexibility rather than a fixed biological barrier. And archaeological patterns support this interpretation, showing repeated use of locations that offer reduced airflow or more stable ground conditions, which would have helped moderate the rate of heat exchange in the absence of fur. And this indicates that the human body's openness to the environment did not prevent survival, but it required a continuous interaction with surroundings that other animals could partially avoid, and within that interaction, the body's limits were not fixed in one place but shifted depending on how effectively the environment could be used to slow or redirect these exchanges. And over time, this difference in how the body relates to its surroundings becomes a defining feature of human life before clothing, not as a weakness, but as a condition that shapes how space is experienced, how rest is maintained, and how movement is organized in relation to the constant flow of heat and air across the skin. When there is no insulating layer to slow the exchange between body and environment, the limits of human physiology are approached not in sudden moments, but through steady accumulation, as small losses or gains of heat continue over time, until the body must respond, and this makes duration as important as intensity, because a condition that feels manageable at first can gradually become difficult when it persists, especially during periods of stillness when the body is no longer generating as much heat through movement. And in this state, the exposed surface of the skin allows heat to move outward more freely when the surrounding air is cooler, while also making it harder to retain warmth once it has been lost. And this does not mean that early humans were constantly at risk, but that their bodies operated within a narrower range where balance could be maintained without additional protection, and outside that range, adjustments were required, whether through movement, seeking different ground, or positioning the body in relation to wind and terrain. And archaeological evidence suggests that such adjustments were common, reflected in patterns of site use that favor locations offering even slight moderation of environmental conditions, indicating that early humans were sensitive to how quickly these limits could be reached. And unlike animals with fur that can extend the time before these limits are approached by maintaining a layer of trapped air, the human body experiences these shifts more directly, making the boundary between comfort and strain less fixed and more dependent on immediate surroundings. and this creates a form of living where stability is temporary and must be continuously maintained rather than assumed. And over long periods of human history, this constant proximity to physiological limits would have shaped not only behavior but perception, reinforcing the importance of environments that slow change, reduce exposure, and allow the body to remain within its range for longer. And within this context, the absence of clothing is not only a lack of material, but a condition that defines how the body exists in relation to time, where even small differences in duration can determine whether balance is sustained or gradually lost. Temperature is not experienced by the human body as a fixed number, but as a continuous exchange that depends on air movement, surface contact, and the balance between heat produced and heat lost. And without clothing, this exchange becomes more immediate and more difficult to slow, because there is no layer to hold warmth close to the skin or to reduce the speed at which the surrounding air carries it away. And in warmer conditions, this openness allows heat to leave the body more efficiently through sweat and airflow, supporting endurance and movement across open landscapes. But when conditions shift toward cooler air or when movement stops, the same openness leads to faster heat loss, especially when wind increases or when the ground beneath the body draws heat away through direct contact. And this means that the experience of temperature is not stable across time, but changes with posture, activity, and location, creating a situation where the body must remain responsive even when it is at rest. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans favored environments where these exchanges were moderated, such as areas with reduced wind or more stable ground, indicating that even small differences in temperature experience mattered. And from a biological perspective, this reflects how the human body operates within a narrow range, where internal processes can maintain balance. But outside that range, adjustment becomes necessary. And without clothing, the boundary of that range is reached more quickly, not because the body is insufficient, but because it is directly connected to the environment without delay. And this creates a form of awareness that is tied to constant feedback, where temperature is not something observed from a distance, but something that shapes how long a person can remain in one place, how deeply they can rest, and how often they must move. And within this ongoing interaction, the absence of clothing is not simply a lack of protection, but a condition that defines how temperature is lived as a continuous and shifting relationship between body and world. The human body does not respond to heat and cold as separate experiences, but as variations of the same continuous process where internal balance must be maintained despite constant change. And without clothing, this process becomes more exposed because there is no external layer to slow down how quickly the environment affects the body. So when the air becomes warmer, the body relies on sweating and increased blood flow near the skin to release heat, allowing evaporation to carry warmth away, which is effective in open air where movement is present. But when humidity rises or airflow decreases, this system becomes less efficient, causing heat to remain closer to the body. And in contrast, when the air becomes cooler, the body reduces blood flow near the surface to preserve warmth. But without insulation, this preservation is limited, as heat continues to move outward through the exposed skin, especially in stillness. And this creates a dynamic where the body must constantly adjust between losing and retaining heat, never fully stabilizing for long periods. And archaeological patterns suggest that early humans responded to this by selecting environments that helped extend the effectiveness of these internal processes, such as shaded areas in heat or wind-protected zones in cooler conditions, indicating that while the body could regulate itself, it depended on external support to remain within its limits. And this reliance is not a weakness, but a defining feature of how humans adapted to diverse climates, using behavior and space rather than biological insulation alone. And over time, this constant adjustment shaped how temperature was experienced, not as a fixed state, but as a shifting condition that influenced when to move, when to rest, and where to remain. And within this ongoing balance, the absence of clothing meant that the body could never fully separate itself from the process, remaining directly involved in every change that passed through the air and across the skin. When the body remains exposed without any insulating layer, its limits are reached not by sudden extremes but through gradual accumulation, as small differences in temperature, airflow, and surface contact continue over time until the internal balance becomes difficult to maintain. and this makes duration as important as intensity, because a condition that feels manageable for a short period can become increasingly demanding when it persists, especially when the body is at rest and producing less heat through movement. And in this state, even a mild flow of air can increase heat loss, while prolonged contact with cooler ground can draw warmth away steadily, and without clothing to slow these exchanges, the body has fewer ways to retain heat once it begins to lose it, which means that stability depends on constant adjustment rather than passive protection. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans rarely remained in one place when these limits were approached, moving between locations that offered slight differences in exposure, such as reduced wind or more stable surfaces, indicating that awareness of these limits was reflected in patterns of movement rather than fixed solutions. And unlike animals with fur that can maintain a more stable internal state despite external variation, the human body experiences these changes more directly, making the boundary between comfort and strain more fluid and dependent on immediate surroundings. And over time, this would shape how environments were used, not as static spaces but as parts of a shifting system where the body moved in response to accumulating effects. And within this system, the absence of clothing defines not only how temperature is felt, but how time itself is experienced, as the body remains within a continuous process of adjustment, approaching its limits gradually and responding before those limits are fully reached. When light fades and the air begins to cool, the human body without clothing enters a different condition, not because the environment becomes immediately harsh, but because the processes that maintained balance during the day begin to shift, and without sunlight to provide warmth and without movement to generate internal heat, the body gradually loses energy to the surrounding air, especially when the ground beneath it is cooler and continues to draw heat away through direct contact. And in this state, even small movements of air can increase the rate of heat loss, because there is no insulating layer to slow the exchange, and this makes stillness more difficult to sustain over time, as the body must either adjust position or remain exposed to a steady decrease in warmth. And unlike animals with fur that can retain a layer of trapped air close to the skin during rest, the human body allows air to move freely across its surface, which changes how quickly temperature shifts are felt. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans responded to these nighttime conditions by selecting locations that reduced wind and limited contact with cold surfaces, such as areas near rock formations or slight depressions in the ground, indicating that night was not simply a continuation of day, but a period where the limits of exposure became more noticeable. And this does not imply constant danger, but a different rhythm of adjustment, where the body could not rely on the same balance as before and had to respond more frequently to maintain stability. And within this transition, the absence of clothing becomes more apparent, not as a sudden problem, but as a gradual change in how the body experiences time, where each moment of stillness allows more heat to leave than is produced, and where rest itself becomes part of an ongoing exchange rather than a complete pause, shaping how early humans position themselves, how long they remained still, and how they moved through the night without a layer to hold warmth close to the body. During periods of rest at night, the human body without clothing loses heat in a way that is steady rather than sudden. And this steady loss becomes more significant because there is no layer to slow the transfer between the skin and the surrounding air. So as the body remains still, the warmth that was generated through movement during the day is no longer replaced at the same rate, and instead begins to dissipate through exposed surfaces, especially when the air is cooler than the body, and when the ground beneath it continues to draw heat through direct contact. And this process is influenced not only by temperature but by airflow, because even a light movement of air can carry heat away more quickly. And without insulation, this effect is felt across the entire surface of the skin, making the body more sensitive to changes that might otherwise be reduced. And in contrast, animals with fur maintain a layer of trapped air that slows this exchange, allowing them to retain warmth longer during rest, while the human body must rely on positioning, movement, or the selection of more protected environments to reduce the rate of heat loss. And archaeological patterns suggest that early humans were aware of these differences, not in abstract terms, but through repeated experience, choosing locations where wind was reduced, surfaces were less conductive, or natural features offered partial buffering, indicating that even small changes in environment could extend the time before the body approached its limits. And this creates a situation where rest is not a complete pause, but a controlled state where the body continues to adjust, balancing the loss of heat with the need to remain still, and over time, this would shape how early humans experience night, not as a uniform period of inactivity, but as a sequence of moments where stability was maintained only within a narrow range, and where the absence of clothing meant that the body remained directly involved in every exchange. Unable to fully separate itself from the gradual flow of heat into the surrounding world, wind and moisture do not change the body in isolation, but they alter the speed and direction of the same process that is always present. And without clothing, their influence becomes more immediate because there is no layer to slow how quickly air and water interact with the skin. So when air moves across the body, it carries heat away more efficiently than still air, increasing the rate of cooling even when the temperature itself does not change significantly. And this means that a place that feels stable in calm conditions can become less so when airflow increases. And moisture adds another layer to this interaction, because damp air or wet surfaces can change how heat is transferred, often making the body lose warmth more quickly over time, especially during periods of rest when internal heat production is lower, and without insulation the body cannot easily retain warmth once it begins to lose it, which creates a condition where small environmental factors combine to produce larger effects. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans responded to these conditions by selecting environments that reduced wind exposure and avoided prolonged contact with damp ground, indicating that even subtle differences in airflow and moisture influence where rest could be maintained. And this does not imply complete control over the environment, but a continuous adjustment to its variations, where the body remains sensitive to changes that could gradually shift it toward its limits. And over time, this interaction between wind, moisture, and exposed skin would shape patterns of movement and site use, not through fixed solutions, but through repeated choices that reduce the rate of heat loss. And within this ongoing process, the absence of clothing defines how environmental factors are experienced, not as separate elements, but as parts of a continuous exchange that the body must manage directly, moment by moment, without any barrier to separate it from the air and surfaces that surround it. When the human body rests directly on the ground without any layer in between, the exchange of heat and pressure does not occur at a distance but through immediate contact, and this contact becomes one of the most consistent ways the environment influences the body, because the surface beneath it continues to draw heat away as long as there is a difference in temperature, and unlike air, which can shift or slow, the ground remains in constant contact, creating a steady pathway for heat to leave the body over time. And this means that even if the air feels stable, the body can gradually lose warmth through the surface it rests on, especially when that surface is stone or compacted soil, which conduct heat more efficiently than softer materials. And in contrast, layers such as dry grass or loose vegetation can reduce this transfer slightly by trapping small pockets of air, slowing the rate at which heat moves away. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans made use of such differences, selecting resting areas where the ground was less conductive or where natural materials could provide minimal separation, indicating that contact with the surface was not neutral but an important factor in maintaining stability. And this interaction is not limited to temperature alone, because the texture and firmness of the ground also influence how the body distributes its weight, affecting how long it can remain still without discomfort. And without clothing or bedding, there is no buffer to reduce these effects, so the body must continuously adjust its position in response to pressure and heat loss. And over time, this creates a pattern where rest is shaped not only by air and temperature, but by the qualities of the surface itself. And within this pattern, the absence of clothing extends beyond exposure to the air, defining how the body relates to the ground as a direct extension of the environment, where every moment of contact contributes to how long stability can be maintained before adjustment becomes necessary. Moisture changes how the body experiences the ground not by creating a new condition, but by intensifying the same exchange that is already taking place. And without clothing, the skin remains in direct contact with surfaces that may hold water or absorb it from the surrounding air, which alters how heat is transferred, because damp materials conduct heat more efficiently than dry ones, allowing warmth to move away from the body at a faster rate over time. And this means that a surface that feels stable when dry can become less so when moisture is present, even if the temperature itself does not change significantly. And this effect is gradual, building through continued contact rather than appearing suddenly, which makes it more difficult to notice at first, especially during periods of rest when movement is reduced. And in addition to temperature, moisture affects how the body perceives the surface, as wet ground can soften or shift under pressure, changing how weight is distributed and making it harder to remain still for extended periods. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans were sensitive to these differences, favoring areas where the ground remained drier or where natural materials reduced direct contact, indicating that even small variations in moisture influenced where rest could be sustained. And this does not imply complete control over the environment, but a continuous adjustment to its conditions, where the body remains aware of changes that affect its ability to maintain balance. And over time, this interaction between moisture and exposed skin becomes part of a larger pattern, where the environment is not experienced as a single stable surface, but as a shifting set of conditions that must be navigated through movement, positioning, and selection of space. And within this pattern, the absence of clothing extends the body's connection to the ground, making every change in moisture a direct influence on how heat is retained, how pressure is felt, and how long the body can remain at rest without needing to respond. The structure of the surface beneath the body shapes how pressure is distributed, and how long stillness can be maintained. And without clothing or any intermediate layer, this structure is not softened or filtered, but transferred directly into the body through points of contact that remain constant during rest. And this means that uneven ground creates areas of concentrated pressure where certain parts of the body bear more weight than others, leading to gradual discomfort that requires adjustment over time, while more even surfaces allow weight to spread more evenly, extending the duration of stillness before movement becomes necessary. And in contrast to animals with fur that can provide a thin buffer between skin and ground, the human body experiences these differences more directly, making the choice of surface an important factor in how rest is sustained. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans favored locations where the ground was more stable, or where natural materials such as leaves or grass created a more even surface, indicating that the qualities of the ground influenced not only comfort, but the ability to remain in one place without frequent repositioning. And this interaction is not separate from temperature or moisture, but part of the same continuous exchange, where pressure, heat, and surface structure combine to shape how the body experiences rest. And over time, this would create a sensitivity to small differences in terrain, guiding movement towards spaces that allowed for longer periods of stability. And within this context, the absence of clothing is not only about exposure to air or temperature, but about how the body connects to the ground as an extension of the environment, where every detail of the surface becomes part of the body's ongoing adjustment, and where rest is not defined by complete stillness, but by the balance between pressure and the need to move before discomfort accumulates beyond what can be sustained. When there is no layer between the body and the world, the environment does not remain outside, but becomes the main factor shaping how the body feels at every moment, because temperature, air movement, surface contact, and moisture are not filtered or delayed, but enter directly through the skin, creating a condition where sensation is continuously formed by external conditions rather than held stable from within. And in this state, the body does not experience comfort as a fixed baseline, but as a temporary balance that depends on how closely the surrounding environment remains, within a narrow range. And when that range shifts, even slightly, the body responds through changes in posture, movement, or location, not as deliberate strategies, but as immediate adjustments to maintain internal stability. And this makes the environment not just a setting, but an active force that shapes the rhythm of rest and movement, because without clothing, there is no consistent boundary to separate the body from changes in wind, heat, or ground conditions. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans moved between locations that offered different combinations of these factors, selecting spaces where the effects of exposure were reduced, which indicates that the body's experience was closely tied to the qualities of the environment rather than independent of it. And this relationship creates a form of living where stability is never assumed, but always maintained through continuous interaction, and over time, this would shape how space is understood, not as fixed places with stable conditions, but as shifting environments where the body must remain responsive to remain within its limits. And within this ongoing exchange, the absence of clothing defines not only how the body is exposed, but how it perceives the world itself, as something that is not observed from a distance, but directly felt through every change that passes across the skin. Because there is no stable layer to separate the body from the environment, adjustment is not something that happens occasionally, but continuously, unfolding in small, almost unnoticeable changes that accumulate over time. And this means the body is always in the process of responding, shifting blood flow, altering posture, changing position, or subtly increasing movement to compensate for heat loss or gain. And these adjustments are not deliberate in the modern sense, but arise directly from the body's need to remain within a narrow functional range. And without clothing, even slight changes in air movement or ground temperature can trigger these responses, making stillness difficult to sustain for long periods, especially during rest when the body produces less internal heat. And this creates a condition where rest is not a complete pause but a state of controlled adjustment, where the body never fully disengages from the environment. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans adapted to this by selecting spaces that reduced the frequency of required adjustments, such as areas with less wind or more stable ground, indicating that the environment was used to support the body's regulation rather than replace it. And over time, this continuous need to adjust would shape how the body experienced time, not as a sequence of stable moments, but as an ongoing flow where conditions shift gradually and must be met with equally gradual responses. And within this flow, the absence of clothing does not simply increase exposure, but transforms how stability is maintained, making it something that must be actively preserved rather than passively held. And this ongoing interaction between body and environment becomes the foundation of how early humans lived without a protective layer, where balance is not achieved once, but sustained through constant, quiet adaptation. Without an insulating layer, the body cannot hold a stable state for long, because the balance it maintains is continually influenced by small, persistent changes that do not stop, and this makes stability a temporary condition that must be renewed again and again, rather than something that can be sustained passively. Since heat is constantly moving outward when the surrounding air is cooler and inward when it is warmer, and moisture and airflow continuously alter the rate of that movement. So even when conditions seem steady, the body is still engaged in subtle adjustments that prevent it from drifting too far from its functional range. And during rest, this becomes more noticeable because internal heat production is lower, which means that any loss is not easily replaced, and the body gradually approaches its limits unless it changes position, location, or activity. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans rarely remained in a single position for extended periods in fully exposed environments, instead shifting within spaces that offered slight differences in wind, ground, or temperature, indicating that stability was managed through movement rather than maintained in place. And unlike animals with fur that can sustain a buffered internal condition over longer durations, the human body experiences these changes more directly, making the boundary between comfort and strain less defined and more dependent on time and context. And over long stretches of human history, this would shape how environments were used, favoring places that slowed the rate of change and allowed the body to remain within its limits for longer. And within this pattern, the absence of clothing defines not only how exposure is experienced, but how stability itself is understood, not as a fixed state, but as something that exists only for a moment before it must be adjusted again. The absence of clothing does not leave a direct trace in the archaeological record, because materials such as skin, plant fibers, or simple coverings do not preserve easily over long periods, and this means that understanding when clothing was not yet present relies on indirect evidence, drawn from the types of tools that appear, the environments humans occupied, and comparisons with other species. And early sites show extensive use of stone tools for cutting and processing materials, but the consistent presence of tools specifically associated with preparing hides, such as fine scrapers used to soften animal skins, appears later, suggesting that for a long period, humans may not have regularly produced or maintained wearable coverings, And this interpretation is supported by biological evidence, including the adaptation of the human body itself, which had already reduced its natural covering before clear signs of clothing appear, indicating a gap between biological change and cultural response. And within that gap, the body existed without a consistent external layer, relying instead on behavior and environment. And archaeological patterns also show that early human populations were concentrated in regions where temperatures were more moderate, which may reflect the limits of a body without insulation, rather than a deliberate choice of comfort. And as humans gradually moved into more variable climates, the appearance of new tools and practices suggests an increasing need to manage exposure in ways that the body alone could not sustain. And this does not provide a precise moment when clothing began, but it outlines a transition, where the absence of clothing was not a single state but a phase that changed over time, shaped by environment, movement, and gradual innovation. And within this phase, the relationship between body and world remained direct, with no consistent barrier between them. And this is reflected not in preserved garments, but in the patterns of life that emerge from the evidence, where exposure is managed through location and behavior rather than through materials that could create a lasting separation. As archaeological evidence becomes more detailed, certain types of tools begin to appear that suggest a gradual shift toward preparing materials that could serve as coverings, and among these are stone implements with wear patterns consistent with scraping and softening animal hides, indicating repeated contact with flexible organic surfaces rather than hard materials. And while such tools do not prove the existence of clothing in a fully developed sense, they point toward activities that would make raw hides more workable and potentially suitable for wrapping around the body. And this marks a change not only in technology, but in how the environment is used, because instead of relying solely on selecting favorable locations, early humans begin to transform materials into something that can alter their direct exposure. And this transformation does not appear as a sudden innovation but as a gradual accumulation of practices, where the processing of animal remains extends beyond food into other uses, and the timing of these tools in the archaeological record often coincides with evidence of human presence in regions where environmental conditions would place greater demands on the body, suggesting that the need to manage exposure may have influenced their development. And at the same time, biological evidence, such as studies of human parasites that depend on clothing for their life cycle, supports the idea that regular use of body coverings emerged at a later stage, reinforcing the view that there was a long period when humans lived without consistent clothing. And within this transition, the body's direct relationship with the environment begins to change, not by removing exposure entirely, but by introducing the possibility of a partial barrier. And this possibility would gradually alter how heat, air, and surface contact were experienced. Even if the earliest coverings were simple, temporary, and dependent on available materials, and over time, these changes would become more stable, but in their early form, they represent the beginning of a shift from a body fully open to the environment toward one that could, at least occasionally, reduce that openness through the use of materials shaped by human hands. In its earliest forms, any material used to cover the body would not have functioned as a stable or consistent layer, but as something temporary, variable, and closely tied to immediate conditions, because untreated or minimally processed animal skins stiffen as they dry, become heavy when wet, and degrade over time, making them difficult to maintain as reliable coverings without repeated work. And plant-based materials, while more flexible, are often less durable and provide limited insulation, especially in changing weather. And this means that early coverings, if used, would have been irregular in both availability and effectiveness, sometimes reducing exposure and at other times offering little difference from direct contact with the environment. And archaeological evidence does not show a uniform adoption of such materials across all regions at once, suggesting that their use depended on local conditions, resources, and the gradual development of techniques to process and maintain them. And this reinforces the idea that there was no clear boundary between a time without clothing and a time with it, but rather a long transition where the body remained largely exposed even as new possibilities began to appear. And during this period, the relationship between body and environment would have remained fundamentally direct, because these early coverings could not fully replace the role of insulation, nor could they create a stable microenvironment close to the skin in the way that later garments would. and as a result, the body still depended on movement, positioning, and the selection of space to maintain balance, with coverings acting as occasional extensions rather than consistent solutions. And over time, improvements in processing and the repeated use of materials would allow these coverings to become more effective, but in their early stage, they represent a partial shift, where exposure is reduced in moments but not removed, and where the body continues to experience the environment as an active presence, shaping how long rest can be sustained and how stability is maintained. And within this transitional state, clothing is not yet a defining feature of human life, but an emerging response to the limits that the body encounters when it remains open to the world. As coverings became more regularly used, the relationship between the body and the environment began to change in a gradual but meaningful way, not because exposure disappeared, but because it could now be reduced with more consistency, and this consistency altered how heat, air, and surface contact were experienced, since even a simple layer could slow the exchange between skin and surroundings, allowing the body to retain warmth for longer periods or reduce the impact of airflow. And while early materials were still limited in durability and effectiveness, repeated use and improvement in processing techniques would have made them more reliable over time, and archaeological evidence suggests that as humans moved into regions with more variable climates, the need for such consistency increased, encouraging the development of better methods for preparing and maintaining materials, and this marks a shift from occasional use to something closer to regular practice, where the body is no longer fully dependent on environmental selection alone, but begins to carry a partial solution with it. And from a biological perspective, this changes how the body maintains balance, because instead of adjusting constantly to immediate conditions, it can remain within a stable range for longer before those adjustments are required. And this does not remove the influence of the environment, but it delays and reduces it, creating a new form of interaction where the body is not fully open, but not fully separated either. And over time, this partial barrier would allow for longer periods of rest, reduced frequency of movement, and a different experience of temperature and surface contact. And within this transition, clothing begins to function not just as material, but as a way of shaping the boundary between body and world, making that boundary more stable than it had ever been before. As clothing begins to function as a more consistent layer, one of its most noticeable effects is not the complete removal of environmental influence, but the extension of time during which the body can remain stable, because even a simple covering slows the rate at which heat moves between the body and the surrounding air, reducing how quickly warmth is lost during rest and how rapidly external changes are felt. And this means that the body no longer needs to adjust as frequently, allowing periods of stillness to last longer before discomfort or imbalance appears. And in contrast to a fully exposed body where every small shift in airflow or temperature requires response, the presence of a layer creates a delay, giving internal processes more time to maintain balance without immediate correction, and archaeological and biological evidence suggests that this extension of stability would have had significant effects on how early humans used space, because the ability to remain in one place for longer periods reduces the need for constant repositioning and allows rest to become more continuous. And this does not imply complete comfort, but a measurable change in how exposure is experienced, since the body is no longer directly connected to every variation in the environment, and over time, this would influence patterns of movement, making it possible to stay within a single location for longer durations. And from a biological perspective, this shift allows the body to operate further from its limits, reducing the frequency with which it approaches the boundaries of heat loss or gain. And within this change, clothing becomes more than a protective layer, acting as a regulator of time itself, altering how long the body can remain within a manageable state. And in doing so, it transforms the rhythm of daily life from one defined by constant adjustment to one where stability can be sustained for longer, even if only partially, and this gradual extension of stability marks a key step in the transition from a body fully exposed to one that can maintain balance with less immediate dependence on the surrounding environment. As clothing becomes more reliable, the change it brings is not limited to the body's temperature or surface contact, but extends into how space itself is experienced, because a consistent layer creates a subtle boundary that separates internal conditions from external variation. and this separation does not remove the environment but slows how quickly it is felt, allowing the body to exist within a more stable range even as the outside continues to change. And in this state, the body no longer responds immediately to every shift in air or ground, but maintains a delayed relationship with those changes, which alters how time and sensation are perceived. And archaeological patterns suggest that as clothing became more common, human presence expanded into environments that would have been more difficult to sustain without such a layer, indicating that this boundary allowed the body to operate in conditions that were previously closer to its limits. And from a biological perspective, this creates a new form of interaction where the body is not fully merged with its surroundings, but exists within a moderated space that it carries with it. And this changes how environments are evaluated, because the need to find precise conditions is reduced when some of those conditions can be maintained independently of location. And over time, this would influence movement, settlement patterns, and the duration of rest, as the body becomes less dependent on immediate environmental qualities and more capable of sustaining stability across different settings. And within this shift, clothing functions not only as protection, but as a transformation in how the boundary between body and world is understood, turning a previously continuous exchange into something that can be partially controlled, and in doing so, it reshapes the experience of space from one defined by constant exposure to one where a degree of separation allows for greater continuity, even as the environment remains present beyond that boundary. Even in environments where clothing is constant and reliable, the human body continues to respond to the world in ways that reflect a much older condition, because the systems that regulate temperature, sense airflow, and respond to surface contact were formed during a time when there was no consistent barrier between the body and the environment. And this means that even now, the skin remains sensitive to changes that clothing only partially reduces, not eliminates. So when air moves across exposed areas or when temperature shifts slightly, the body still reacts through the same processes of heat exchange and adjustment, indicating that the underlying relationship between body and environment has not disappeared, but has been layered over with additional protection. And archaeological and biological evidence suggests that for most of human history, clothing was not always present or reliable, which would have reinforced the development of these responsive systems, making them a stable part of human physiology rather than a temporary adaptation. And this persistence can be observed in how people continue to prefer certain conditions, often seeking environments that feel stable, protected, or balanced even when clothing provides a degree of insulation, suggesting that the body recognizes and responds to moderated spaces in ways that extend beyond immediate necessity. And from a biological perspective, this reflects how deeply exposure has shaped human experience, creating a system that remains active even when its original conditions are no longer constant. And over time, this creates a layered experience where modern protection exists alongside older patterns of response, and within this layering, the absence of clothing in earlier periods is not simply a past state, but a foundation that continues to influence how the body perceives and interacts with its surroundings today. When a consistent layer covers the body, the sense of stability that follows is not only physical, but also perceptual, because the reduction in direct exposure allows the body to experience fewer rapid changes, and this creates a quieter internal state where adjustment is less frequent and less immediate. So instead of continuously responding to airflow, temperature shifts, or surface contact, the body can remain within a narrower range for longer periods, and this extended stability changes how awareness is organized, narrowing attention from a wide field of constant input to a more contained experience. And although clothing does not eliminate environmental influence, it reduces its intensity and delays its effect, allowing internal regulation to operate with less urgency. An archaeological and biological perspective suggests that this shift would have had long-term effects on how humans relate to their surroundings, because the presence of a stable layer makes it possible to remain in environments that would otherwise require constant adjustment. And this does not mean that the body becomes independent of the environment, but that it interacts with it through a moderated boundary rather than direct exposure. And over time, this moderation contributes to a sense of protection that is not absolute, but sufficient to allow rest and stillness to extend beyond what was previously possible. And within this experience, the body begins to associate coverage with reduced demand, not as a conscious thought but as a pattern of response shaped by repeated exposure and gradual reduction of it. And this pattern persists even in modern conditions, where clothing is always present, suggesting that the sense of stability it provides is rooted in a long history of living without it. And within that contrast, the difference between exposure and coverage becomes more than physical, forming part of how the body understands and organizes its relationship with the world. Clothing does not simply add a layer to the body, it changes the way the boundary between body and world is lived, because it introduces a space where conditions can be held for longer, allowing the body to exist with less immediate dependence on external variation. And this change is not absolute but gradual, as the layer reduces the speed of heat exchange, softens contact with surfaces, and alters how air moves across the skin, creating a moderated environment that the body carries with it. And within this moderated space, the body can remain within its functional range for extended periods without continuous adjustment, which reshapes the rhythm of rest, movement, and perception. And archaeological and biological evidence suggests that this shift did not occur at a single moment, but developed over time, as materials became more reliable and techniques more consistent, gradually transforming clothing from an occasional response into a stable feature of human life. And as this transformation unfolded, the direct and constant exposure that once defined human experience became less dominant, replaced by a layered interaction where the environment is still present, but no longer immediate in the same way. And this does not remove the body's sensitivity to change, but it alters how that sensitivity is expressed, allowing for longer periods of stability and a different awareness of space. And within this change, clothing becomes more than protection, functioning as a mediator that shapes how the body relates to time, to place, and to the conditions that surround it. And yet beneath this mediated experience, the older pattern remains, where the body is capable of responding directly to the environment, reminding us that the separation created by clothing is something that was built gradually rather than given from the beginning, and that without it, the world would still be felt not at a distance, but across the entire surface of the body in every moment, leaving an open question about how much of our present sense of stability depends on a boundary that did not always exist, and could, in its absence, return the body to a more immediate relationship with the world.